How's it going, Sam?
It's going well now.
Now, yeah, we had some technical issues getting started, but thankfully they are resolved. Good to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
For those of you turning in for the first time, my name is Nick Dagan Best. His name is Sam Reynolds. We are astrologers, and this is part of an ongoing conversation that we started a few weeks ago. I don't know if we'll end it today. I think it
That's
could
the
keep going.
aspiration.
That's the aspiration. We'll do what we can. But okay. Yeah, there's a part one and a part two to this conversation, and we're proceeding as though you've been following all along. So we're just dropping in the middle here, or not even the middle, I'd say. We're coming close to the end of my presentation, my slideshow. Wait a minute, where's my yeah, it's been quite the day for technical issues. All right. Okay. So without further ado, I think before I continue, I'll issue the same caveat that we've done with the first two episodes, that obviously the subject we're touching on is a very sort of emotional one and sensitive one, and some of the images that come up here are disturbing. They're disturbing in their nature, and so and by definition offensive. We're not showing them to offend, we're showing them to report. But yeah, without further ado, we landed at the first episode. We've managed to bookend everything very nicely in that we ended the first episode with the end of the 19th century. We ended the 20th century, the second episode pretty much at the end of the 20th century here, 1999, close to it. And then I'll just have some other following remarks, and then we get into your slideshow, Sam.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So 1999 was really when the mass shooting phenomenon. I mean, it had existed before, but something happened with Columbine in 99. I found Columbine was during a Black 1 interval before the summer's Red 5 interval. But there was sort of an explosion of shootings in the summer of 1999. This is the one that's specifically racially motivated that I'm showing here, but I have a bunch of slides of a bunch of different ones. Just in the sense that like where it started just happening so often that you started to become well, not necessarily desensitized to it, but it starts to seem like I don't know, like
occurrence.
Yeah, like say violence in the Middle East, where it's just like, oh, that's something that's just happening every day, no matter what, no matter where the planets are, kind of thing. But this was one that happened in Chicago that was quite gruesome. But like I said, it was a summer of a lot of different school shootings. I'm just showing this one that was specifically racially motivated. Now, 8 years later, 2007. Now, what I love about this event is this was the same month that my original article, Cycles of Injustice, was published in the ESAR Journal, and then I put it on my website. And what was funny at the time was 2007, to my mind. I mean, not necessarily because of reality, but because of my exposure to the news cycle at the time. We were still in the era of mass media at the time. YouTube was barely getting started. So I thought of it as like in terms of the racial struggle in the United States. I thought it was a sort of a calm period, I suppose. And when I wrote the article, I was almost thinking like, gee, am I talking about, this is like the naive white Canadian guy, gee, am I talking about something that's really just like history? Right. I know. Laugh it up. But then this thing happened in Louisiana. There was a situation with some students, high school students in Jenna, Texas. It wasn't, it wasn't like super, like it wasn't violent or anything, but it was serious enough that you got a big protest rally there in Jenna in 2007. And they said this was the biggest sort of human rights / civil rights, racially related march since the March on Washington in 1963. This was the biggest one that had occurred since then. So when I published the article, I'm like, oh, okay, so this, stuff is still happening, and this was kind of a big deal at the time. And then I'm just including this as a marker, but 4 years later,
yeah.
we had the Occupy Wall Street, which is, sort of a different sort of uprising, but it is a sort of sensitive period for that. Okay, and then now we're at 2015.
Are we gonna go back to that? Because I do want to.
Oh,
talk
did
about
you want to go
Occupy.
to Occupy? Yeah. Tell me about Occupy. Yeah.
Because I was there. I wasn't
Okay.
in Zuccotti Park, but I was living in New York
Mm.
at the time, and so I did go to see it. And it was fascinating to me because one of the things, and I talked about this when I had my Twitter account at the time, because the natural question that I imagine some of our viewers are having is like, it's good to know these things, right? I mean, to
Mm.
look at it through the lens of astrology and history. But as I was talking to Karen Hunter, another not an
Mm.
astrologer, but a media person, she asked a very sensible question, like, okay, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
And Occupy Wall Street was a moment when I was formulating particular thoughts, knowing that the US was going toward its Pluto return. Some of the things I'm going to talk about in my show, the things that you're talking about related to this Venus, moment, in
Mm.
terms of the synodic cycle, being with Venus just becoming an evening star. What I want to say to people looking at this, and particularly focusing on Occupy Wall Street, is that it's important for us to study our history and study movements if you want to talk about changes to said movements or with said movements. And one of the things I learned about Occupy Wall Street, it's not funny, but it is sort of related to what we're talking about in a lot of different levels. One, we're talking about some modern astrologers look at Venus as a corollary related to wealth and money, and Occupy Wall Street was definitely about the 1%
Mm.
versus everyone else. So that is the continuity of our Venus theory. But the other thing is, I realized looking at the site, it was a bad idea just to kind of sequester the movement to Zuccotti Park.
Mm.
Because what the police did, what becomes easier for the police to manage is when people gather in one central location.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. They were like, oh, okay, you just want to stay here? All right, bet. And so the police actually, slowly started working the perimeter of that area. And when I say slowly, I mean it was within weeks but
Mm.
they kind of were encompassing. And when they got frustrated enough with the things that they felt were happening in Zuccotti Park, whether that was, there's a lot of great things. People were trading things. It was more trying to get away from a capitalist model. It was more a
Sure.
barter model,
Right.
and people were doing things like that. Maybe some people got a little out of hand. You're always going to have some ruffians, right, in a group like that.
Sure.
But when the police got tired of them, they cordoned it off, swooped down, and started arresting folks and broke down Zuccotti Park.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just
Well,
want to kind of,
it's I mean, to my mind, it's an old New York City tradition. I remember being in Tompkins Square Park not long after they cleared the homeless back in the late 80s. Um, I've been privy to a few police sweeps of Washington Square Park. It's just a kind of, it's an old, and that's what Zuccotti Park essentially became, was, culturally a sort of, a more sort of Lower East Side village mentality, wandered it down
correct.
to the Wall Street area, was effectively what you got. And yeah, so I mean, I'm not surprised they did that, and you're absolutely right that these are the easiest situations for the police to manage. It's really sort of, playing right into their hands to organize a protest in this way. That being said, there's, you did have this little microcosm of a society, micro society here, this little community that emerged. And yeah, I think a lot of things sort of came out of this experience that have been really, really important, even if the event itself was something of a damp squib in the end, in terms of
Yeah, yeah.
and I've seen this with other when it comes to the blue interval uprisings. They really do seem to be like potent in the long term, but not really, sort of successful in their actual
Oh,
aims.
that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm reminded of in 1848 during the Blue Three interval, there were uprisings all over Europe. This is Karl Marx being exiled, and Wagner having to leave Germany. All kinds of people had to leave their respective European countries because they were involved in uprisings and things like that. And yeah, it's considered like a series of failed revolutions that happened all over Europe, but they're hugely influential in terms of everything that sort of followed in European history, leading up to the wars and everything. So that's my sense. I can think of other examples too, but yeah, the
No, but
blue.
you're right. You're right on target because there's an EK White talking about this in the
Mm,
in the chat, and one of the things that they're bringing up is how this particular movement and moment also correlated with changes and challenges happening in Arab Spring.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and what's interesting is to see the T square between Venus, Uranus, Pluto. This was during the famous Uranus Pluto squares that we were having. There were about 7 of them. I want to say, was it pretty much from 2010 to 2015? Am
mhm,
I remembering correctly?
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, so there were these Uranus Pluto squares, and then Venus is right there, you know,
yeah,
again at blue 5. And so it speaks to exactly what you're talking about, where we have, this flash, but it
yeah,
has a resonating effect because I think what came out of Occupy Wall Street was the language related to the 1%. I don't remember hearing as much about the 1% before
right,
2011.
right.
I think that surfaced as part of now the lexicon, all the way into like now 2023.
Yeah, and it's especially interesting because it's a rhetoric. I think the thing about Occupy Wall Street, and rhetoric like the 1%, is that it made its way into the mainstream of both sides of the political divide.
Hmm.
Because you'll hear like right wingers with a straight face, talk about like they're the ones fighting the 1%, like it's yeah, it became it really sort of reset. Yeah, it does remind me of 1848, and that it set the agenda for everything that everyone is sort of focused on combating. It identified a sort of a common enemy. Um,
Yeah, and I think what also came out of this when we talk about 1%, which I think is also still used, elite.
mm,
And so it becomes speaking to what you were talking about, and then what the quote I sent you, it deals with matters of taste,
yeah,
right? In
yeah,
terms of how one acquires and fulfills taste. What's interesting with you going back to 1848, so I look at Marxism, socialism, communism, which are completely distinct things. I know that, right?
yeah,
Intellectually. Um, but what I look at that as a parallel commentary to capitalism, and a lot of people who haven't studied Marx or studied, some of his ideas or what's come subsequently from his ideas, think capitalism also has always existed, which is not true, right? I mean, mercantilism has always existed, but there's a difference between mercantilism and capitalism. And when I see capitalism and even communism or,
mhm,
Marxist thought as a dialogue about desire, what becomes our relationship to desire? Um, and I think this is also very apropos in our discussion about Venus,
mm,
because what capitalism says is that let's mass produce desire, right? Or the fulfillment of desires. I
mm,
mean, that's kind of if you ever want to know, in my opinion, the distinction, this is more for the crowd than you, Nick, but if you ever want to know the distinction between, mercantilism and capitalism, it's the scale at which we're talking about producing and then offering and selling things, right?
Mm,
Mercantilism, you know, if you're talking about casks of wine that you're bringing to the market from your farm, you're gonna have a limited supplier, as versus, and that's how it was for a wine cellar, as versus, the mass productions of wines, that we can go to factories and all these other things using capital that we can leverage to produce more. That becomes a distinction. And so,
sure.
yeah, we have a massive scale of things now. Okay, well, that's been true since the Industrial Revolution, which is pretty much our response. Communism, socialism, and Marxist thought in general becomes this way in which we try to articulate. Maybe I wouldn't say curb desire, but think about desire beyond just selfish means, or
Mm.
as how it's amassed. I don't know. I mean, I'm rambling and not even rambling. I'm going on about desires here, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about
Yeah,
this.
I do. I mean, 1840. I mean, first of all, what capitalists often forget is the term capitalism was coined by Marx. It's a
Hmm.
Marxist term. It can only be used like in that sort of, or at least its original intention was defined that way. But it's in 1848, as all these riots are erupting over Europe. That's exactly when Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. The whole idea of breaking chains, and it was more about a sort of a class uprising,
Right.
more than anything, which ultimately is what Occupy Wall Street is. The other thing I wanted to say, just to step out of the slideshow for a moment, because you mentioned the Arab Spring. Um, well, maybe it's going to take a minute for me to open my Solar Fire.
Yeah, it might be
I,
pretty fast. It's working. What are
yeah,
you?
I
Are you on
thought
a Mac?
I am
You
on a
still on
Mac.
a Mac? Wow.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I think it's opening now. All right, here we are.
Hmm.
I just wanted to show you the thing about the Arab Spring, um, and its relation. Just coming back to the astrology of it all. When the Arab Spring was breaking up, it was earlier in 2011. Um, yeah, it's sort of. You can start it here. You can, later on, it's sort of the following month, it really erupts in Egypt and so forth.
Look at that.
And then by the blue five of that we were looking at, not long after Occupy Wall Street is going on, that's when uh, Gaddafi is killed
In Libya.
in Libya, and that's kind of the culmination in some ways of everything happening this year. But what I want to point out about the Arab Spring, first of all, you have this Sun Mars, very rare Sun Mars conjunction, going from Capricorn to Aquarius. I think the actual conjunction is in Aquarius, but these are the two rarest signs for Sun Mars, both for the Mars retrogrades, but also for Sun Mars conjunctions. And then you had Venus coming out of a retrograde. Here, Venus had only just stationed direct it had been retrograde in Scorpio and gone back to late Libra, and it had only just stationed direct less than 2 months earlier. And the reason this is interesting is that 32 years earlier, now this isn't the Arab world, this is the Persian world, but it is still the Muslim world. 32 years later, what we had during the because 32 years is of simultaneous Venus and Mars return, right?
Okay.
And it was, you can sort of look at this chart of when the Shah flees Iran, and you've got a Sun Mars conjunction
Oh wow, in
in
Scorpio. I mean
Capricorn,
Capricorn. Sorry.
going into Aquarius, just like you had with the beginning of the Arab Spring.
Right. Wow.
And you also have Venus coming out of the retrograde, the Red 2 retrograde. This is 48 days, after it had stationed direct in Scorpio. It's the same Venus retrograde. It gradually went from Scorpio back to Libra. But in other words, if you put these two events on a biwheel, right, you get the Sun Mars. These are events 32 years apart, but you get the same Sun Mars and you get the same Venus.
Wow.
And so I'm always struck by that. This again, I'm not conflating the Arab and Persian world.
Yeah, you'll get in trouble.
Well, it's not even. I'm not so much worried about trouble as I'm worried about accuracy. I just try to be accurate.
Fair.
That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but I'm also not necessarily avoiding offending anyone. I just want to be accurate, and no matter where but these are Middle Eastern uprisings, major uprisings that unseat leaders. And I find it interesting the way that the pattern sort of holds between these two things.
I mean, that's really, really dope because, Venus classically is seen as one of the key stars, if not the star, for Islam. It's believed that when we have the star and the
Yeah,
crescent moon,
sure.
it's believed that that is Venus.
Yeah,
And then even classical astrologers, even Islamic astrologers would talk about Venus as a star sacred to Islam. And the other thing is, Muslims, both in terms of the Sunni and the Shiite world, both convene on Friday, which is a
right.
Venus day.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is pretty much on the money in that, there is a parallel.
Absolutely. I mean, I would imagine I've noted that, of course, the five-pointed star is on, any Muslim flag. I mean, Turkey, Pakistan, well, those, even the secular ones is what I mean, let alone
Hmm.
the religious ones. But I mean, that's the beauty of the five-pointed star. First of all, it's just a natural depiction of the Venus synodic cycle, but also, the five-pointed star is indeed, it's an important part of the Muslim emblem. But it's also, there's 50 of them on the American flag, and it was on the Soviet flag, and it's on the PRC flag. It's like everyone claims it, which is so Venus.
Right.
Like it literally belongs. It's literally the thing that even the communists and the imperialists can agree on.
Well, I mean, I have a question related to that. I mean, like, Mars's cycle isn't as neat, I mean,
No,
literally,
no,
as Venus, but doesn't it form like a five-pointed something, even though it's not as even?
no. You get 7 retrogrades in a 15-year return. But it's really it's even weirder than that, because the returns are alternating sums of 15 and 17 years.
Hmm.
So yeah, which is why you get to 32, which is why you get a Mars return at 32, because it's 15 plus 17. But then you go from 15 to 15 plus 17 to 32, plus 15 to 47, plus 17 to 64, which is another Venus Mars return, and then plus 15 to 79. So
Yeah,
Mars
but
is
that doesn't
really,
make
really strange.
it doesn't make another. I mean, I've seen like where when people do sacred geometry, it makes like a lopsided um
Yeah,
pentagram or something.
it'll be lopsided, but I would think of it as a 7-pointed lopsided star as opposed to a
Okay.
symmetrical 5-pointed star.
Why I
If
say
I
that? Yeah, go. I'm sorry. Go on.
Yeah, no, just if I'm trying to, I mean, this is something I've been wrestling with for a while. It's a lot harder to take the Mars synodic cycle and break it down into like this even 20 interval system that I could do so easily with Venus, precisely because it is so asymmetrical. So it's something that I've really wrestled with. But the closest I would say I can come to doing that is putting like a sort of, yeah, a lopsided 7-pointed star in a circle, and that kind of depicts Mars in its, at least its first 15-year return.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I know in Kabbalah, Gevura, which relates to Mars, right,
Mhm.
is said to be Sephira 5 or relate to 5, which also has this interesting correlation to the pentagon and pentagram in a different way.
Mhm.
So again, Venus and Mars, I call archons related to desire itself, and even though I talked about Venus related to desire, so it's
Yeah.
just kind of interesting to see that kind of correlation.
Well, they're definitely a pair.
Hmm.
One takes them as a pair, no matter what kind of astrology you're doing. That's always sort of implied, regardless of how you interpret the pairing. Um, but I mean, I think you can use the symbolism in a lot of different ways, but I'm just thinking of just the natural cycle
Right.
The fact that that 5-pointed star of Venus, yeah, regardless of what tradition you're sort of looking at, it depicts something that is actually happening in the sky. And
Fair enough.
yeah, and so in trying to sort of transpose that to Mars, that's the only answer I can give.
And can I say just a little bit more about this? Because I actually
Yeah,
think
yeah.
about Occupy Wall Street, and not so much about just Mars and Venus. I mean, you clarified. The other thing that I think, especially as we're talking about the Pluto return, well, we're not doing that right now, but I plan to talk a little bit about the Pluto return, and we
Yeah.
see this Venus Pluto Uranus T square. Even though we've been focused on not just race, but even some aspects of ethnicity and how
Mhm.
we have
Yeah.
this disparateness, it does often come to, I don't think it singularly comes to, but it often does come to financial resources and how
Oh, yeah,
they're
yeah.
laid out. We've talked a bit about Dr. King, here. And Dr. King has been in the news recently. I don't know if Dr.
Yes.
King and Obama have been in the news recently.
Yeah.
But one of the things that people need to understand, other than that, going back to, the March on Washington, is that King at the end of his life did talk a lot about guaranteed income, about
Yeah.
economic disparity,
Mhm.
and wanting to correct that. So, I think most progressive folks who've talked about race and ethnic divides have also talked about economic divides as well. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was something I already believed before I moved to South Africa. But having lived in South Africa, just you really, I mean, it's hard enough to ignore in our society, but when you're there, it's like, yeah, if the financial fighting the financial disparity is the main part of the struggle. Um, it's not the whole thing, but boy, it's a big chunk of the problem is that just the money is nowhere near divided fairly amongst people.
And this is not just racially, or do you think it's also between?
Well, there are parallel lines that occasionally sort of or frequently, I should say, interact. They're not the same line, but they wind up sort of colliding a lot. Like they're yeah, two lines that generally run parallel to each other, but occasionally intersect or often intersect. But you can't solve racial disparity without doing something about financial disparity. It's just it won't it it's toothless without it. Is
Yeah, and
the
I think
answer.
it's foundational related to how we talked about Venus so far. Regardless how you look at Venus, whether through a Mars lens, or I mean a Mars lens, through a class lens or a racial lens, or you look at through a classical lens or a modern sense. Um, One of the things I think about with Venus is, yes, consensus, and I mentioned desire, but again, it comes back to taste and the roots. And this is what I'm going to talk about in my presentation. Some of the roots of the rise of racial disparity started with acquired tastes. I think I mentioned the first time I showed a little bit from my presentation how I look at Venus related to sugar, and
Mm,
the first set of plantations where the Spanish and the
yeah,
Portuguese were looking for workers
yeah,
started with enslaving folks, and so
for
it
sure.
progressed. And at first it was like, whoever we can catch. You're Irish? Yeah, we gotta get you too. But
Well,
after a
I mean, I
while,
think I think all I mean, sugar is a really obvious one, but I mean, I think most of the slave trade was done in the name of cultivating products that emerged initially as total luxuries, right? I
mhm,
mean, whether it was sugar, coffee, uh,
tobacco,
tobacco,
cotton.
yeah, yeah. These were things that at first were luxury items before they sort of became common and household. Um, And even, even if you go back to, before the Europeans, you're looking at spice trading, and even
Yeah.
that is Venusian.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, it's the thing we desire. That, I mean, literally, someone wants a cup of coffee so much that they're willing to, chain someone to a coffee field and force them to, cultivate this. I mean, I love coffee too, but that's a hell of a thing to put someone through just so you can have it. Um,
Yeah, and B Havens is waving in here, someone in the chat, and they're
uh-huh.
also saying like
Yeah, I'm not paying
mining, which is
attention.
true.
I'm
Oh
not. I,
yeah,
I
I'm
wasn't
here
looking
for
at the chat. So
I'm here for that.
okay.
I'm so used to it now. I mean, I'm like, where's the chat? Like, I'm in live consultations. Like, is your chat here? No, I mean they're mentioning mining, which I think is important. That was another, in terms of other luxury items, especially when we talk about Africa, and South Africa, especially. Like, it blows my mind to think about. We talk so much about Elon Musk, but Elon comes from, you know, a legacy
Yeah.
from
Oh yeah.
gold
Yeah.
lending,
Yeah. Yeah.
from his father kind of having mining in South Africa, in fact.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, that's still going on.
Hmm.
I mean, look, we're using devices right now. Everyone watching us, you and I, we're all
Hmm.
using devices
Devices. Yep.
that are mined using, mined cobalt from Congo, where we're, like, you can dispute whether or not that what's going on there is slavery or not, technically, but we are totally living off the backs of oppressed people right now, just in doing what we're doing. you know
That's true.
we're participating in that. It bothers me immensely, and I have no idea what to do. um it's one thing to look at history, and look at events that, one was not personally involved with, so there's a little bit of,
Distance.
yeah, it's easy for me to look at 19th century, slave owners and say, oh, look at these terrible people, and they are, but uh like, we're all, in our own way. Okay, we don't, I don't personally own any human beings, but we're all sort of, living off this labor. So it's real to me. It's, that's what being in Africa really sort of drove home for me, is just how much, like, we are participating in this, with it, just by living, just by existing, and living in the system that we do.
Well, that goes back to the difference between mercantilism and
Yeah. Yeah.
capitalism. The mass production of things, which is kind of like how we get the industrial revolution, and then we have enslavement as a precursor to that. um this kind of going toward a level of production and the cost of production in order to have luxury, in order to have like Venus. And one of the things that's interesting, B Havens is talking about this. This is a bit of a tangent but related. I So there's been a conversation in astrology. I know Nick is very familiar with it, for probably over 100 years, about higher octaves, in terms of what constitutes as a higher octave of a inner planet. Like, so many astrologers will talk about Neptune as the higher octave of Venus, and higher octave is going more with the essential energy of a planet that activates our higher consciousness, our evolution, all these particular things. But I've come to believe that Pluto is really, if there is such a thing as higher octaves, I'm not convinced there are. I think Pluto is the higher octave of Venus.
Hmm.
Um, and I think because both deal with deeper aspects of desire. I can't think, even though we don't always like to make a tie-in between mythology and astrology, I think it's there. And there's always some measure of a love story whenever we evoke Pluto or desire, right? Whether we're
Hmm.
talking about Persephone, whether we're talking about Eurydice and Orfeo, whatever we're talking about having to go into the bowels of the earth and extract something or be extracted.
Right.
And I think, and even if you look at one of the glyphs for Venus, I mean for Pluto, sorry, you look at one of the glyphs for Pluto, the one that has like the semicircle and then the circle
Sure.
inside, that one, it looks like Venus, right? So I actually think there is something there with that. So that's kind of one thought I've had. There's a question from Apuba. I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name correctly. I don't know if you know them, because he's like, "Do you remember me?" They're talking about you, Nick.
Okay, I'm the name rings a bell, but
Okay.
I don't remember anyone.
Okay.
I'm the worst. I remember you, Sam, because I've been friends
Right.
with you for 20
Well,
years.
ephemeris. You remember if you
I know
remember a date.
I know it's hopeless. It's hopeless.
Okay,
It's
but
the
see,
worst.
they're
It's the
they're
absolute worst.
asking.
I'm so
They're
embarrassed, but
It's okay, but they're asking, can we say that Venus rules desire that doesn't serve us well? No, I think it can.
no, it's
No,
no,
I think
no.
we could say that it rules desires. Period.
Yeah, yeah,
Whether they serve us well or not, or serve others. I think
yeah, yeah.
how we adjudicate that, work with that, both in the consensual sense that, as we go through these examples, that's up to us. That's my thought.
Yeah, no, it's that would be too simple. I mean, it's just desire. So it can be the healthy desires or the unhealthy desires. That all comes in on another layer. Um, yeah. I had a train of thought, but I've lost it.
Hmm.
Should I go back to the slideshow?
You shall.
Okay. I forget. I'll probably be in the middle of the slideshow, and then I'll suddenly remember.
It'll hit you.
Then I'm like, oh yeah, this was the thing I wanted to say. Okay, yeah. Well, here we are at 2015. Now I'm going to go back to 2014 a little bit later, but I'm just doing the red fives now. And then at the tail end of this, I'm going to show some sort of, known events that didn't occur during a red five interval. But I just want to remind you and people watching, like everything that I've run through, most of the events I've been showing you occurred during the red five Venus interval, when Venus is these days retrograde in Leo. So going back to 1791 in Haiti, going back to 1831 with Nat Turner, going back to 1839 with Amistad, going to the summer of 1863 when you have the New York draft riots and the first armed African American soldiers fighting for the Union, and then 1919 and the Red Summer. 1967 and the uprisings then, prior to Martin Luther King being killed, the school busing altercations of 1965, as 1975 rather. All this stuff I've been talking about, and then 1991, the Crown Heights uprising, all that stuff, and now we find ourselves at 2015, and things get crazy throughout the summer. We had already had 2014, which, like I said, we'll get to in a minute, Ferguson and everything that followed. But 2015, first of all, this town in Texas, the police raided a high school pool party, and we had pictures like this of policemen arresting teenagers in their bathing suits because they were having a pool party, and high school students are have noisy pool parties. Then this terrible thing, Charleston. Dylan Roof just went into this church, this very famous church in Charleston, with great historic importance, and opened fire and killed 9 people. So again, this is like referring back to that 1999 when mass shootings really started becoming a common thing. Sandra Bland, this event really haunted me. This woman just sort of arrested during a traffic stop, and they throw her in jail supposedly for the weekend, and she never comes out alive. And then and also in Denver, we'll be going to George Floyd in a few minutes, but before George Floyd in Minnesota, we had Paul Castaway shot by Denver police. He was First Nations guy. So there was 2015. You started having a bunch of reactions to all these things, and now we find ourselves in 2023, which is, so far, knock wood. The world is as crazy as ever. But we haven't had anything as gruesome as what I've just
Well,
been
maybe
talking about.
yeah, no, we haven't had anything directly like an actual shooting. I don't think. Although I feel like something has happened, but not a shooting.
Yeah.
Um, there's definitely been, this one particular man in, I believe it's Mississippi, who went missing in October.
Okay.
Um, and but the story really just emerged, as these things usually do, more so in May. Rashim, I want to say Rashim Carter, um, in terms of his missing. Uh, and then B. Havens is reporting that a border patrol killed a First Nations guy this week. That must have been in Canada.
That's crazy. Because
Um,
they're not supposed to have to deal with the border, right? I mean, if you're First Nations, then like that border is a formality.
mhm.
Nobody should be killed at the border, but for a First Nations person to be killed at the border it's not even their border. you know
Right.
um that's terrible. Okay, I didn't know about that, B. Havens. Thank you.
Mhm.
But that's just it. I mean, like, I can only, and that's part of what I'm getting at here. Okay.
Oh, they're
Arizona.
saying Arizona. Oh,
Arizona.
you're seeing it
Yeah.
now. Yeah, it's in
Yeah. Yeah.
Arizona.
Yeah. I turned off the screen sharing for a minute. Um, I forgot what I was about to say. Um,
Yeah, you were saying that's the
what,
thing. Yeah.
what I was saying is, this is the thing we're talking. I mean, obviously, like, racial discord has been sort of perpetual in some fashion in American history. I'm really talking about events that seem to sort of stay in memory, largely, mostly. I have. I think some of the events I'm showing in the 19th century really are just sort of markers that they weren't necessarily consequential beyond their individual events, but at least sort of help us keep track of the red five. But the big ones, the 1863, the 1919, the 1967, 1831, 1791. These are objectively events that sort of stay in that add to a narrative that people are still like really connected to.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've always seen as the benefit of your work
Mhm.
is not, I think, not just only understanding, um, mm, not only just understanding the, I guess, the philosophical conceptual framework that you have presented over time, but also to anticipate, like, all cycles. Are we entering a cycle, like we were just saying, like, okay, nothing has happened yet, knock on wood, but is this something where something could jump off? And I think that becomes important for activists, for those who are alert related to the news, to start to contextualize things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. All right. So I wanted to round up just with a few more slides, and then we can move on.
mhm.
Um, just a few things I wanted to address, things that don't occur during red fives. One obvious one is the murder of Dr. King, who we were just talking about. Venus was not retrograde when he was killed. Of course, this murder um, inspired a major uprising. I mean, one that really changed the landscape of the country, right? I mean, because after 1968, you could walk through cities like Washington, D.C., Detroit, a whole number of them. And there are certain sections of the city that for decades afterwards, I think in some cases still, I don't live in the States, so I'm not everywhere all the time, but I can remember walking through Washington, D.C. in 2006, and you still see remnants of what followed this event. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's still
yeah, yeah.
true. I mean, I lived in Newark for 5 years.
Right, right. So
And
yeah.
Newark, and this is, I left there in 2021.
Mm.
Newark is only beginning to emerge out of, you know, the blight that ensued after this
Yeah.
event.
Yeah. Well, Newark, of course, I showed a slide, had a bad uprising of its own in
Yeah.
1967, even before King was killed. But I have no doubt, I'm sure it erupted again when he was murdered. But yeah, exactly. I mean, this really sort of changed everything. Now, the thing about this is, you can see it. His murder occurred April 4th, 1968, which is during a white 4 interval, but the white 4 interval would switch over to a blue 3 interval once we got to April 8th, just 4 days later. So when you jump ahead 24 years to the next blue 3, you get the verdict to the month. So even though King's murder is a white 4, and this event, this is the LAPD officers who were on trial for beating Rodney King. They were found not guilty, and a huge uprising followed this, right? The LA riots of 1992, as they're often referred to. And this is a synodic return of the murder of Dr. King. It's 24 years later to the month.
Wow.
Right. And this is something else, like, certainly for people our age, Sam, this was the big one, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
For our generation, we were too young,
Gen X. Yeah.
Yeah, we were too young in 1968 to know what was happening then. I was in the womb when Dr. King was murdered. But this was something that we saw.
And we were in our 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
Yep, I
23.
remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were looking at that. There is a question from our poolba. I mean, I can't speak for you, Nick. The question is, can you guys talk about the things that has happened in India during this course of this Venus retrograde? I can't, because
Yeah.
I mean,
I have a history of India mapping out Venus retrogrades, but I don't know anything about what's happening specifically this week in the news. I have a historical thing, but it's more 20th century than 21st century. Although
right.
I'd like to update it, but
I know
I'd love
some
to
things
talk.
cursorily from Twitter, but not enough that I would talk intelligently
Yeah,
about
but,
these things, like what's been happening, in Karnataka and other places. I mean, yeah, we're not qualified. I think we talk about where
at some point.
we talk about, yeah, there you are. We talk about where we are. Like in the States, Canada, South Africa,
Yeah.
in terms of, the 21st century. Apuba says there's a lot going on with women. I mean, I think yeah, this goes along with what I've said. I mean, if there is such a thing as higher octaves, and I'm not convinced there are, it's interesting to see, especially in the United States, as one example of Pluto shifts related to what's happening with women. But even, things related to women with Venus being in Leo during this time. So that's not surprising. And weren't we going through a particular synodic cycle with Venus when we had, like, some of the recent uprisings in Iran with women?
Well, I mean, I was just showing you the Iranian Revolution, which came out of the Red 2. By the time the Shah left, it was after Venus had gone direct. But it's during that revolution, during the Red 2 of 1978, that was a Venus retrograde with Uranus and Scorpio. I have a slide somewhere I can show of that. Where are we here? Yeah, here we are. Leading up, this was a massacre that sort of led to the revolution really erupting. So this is September of 78. This is 4 months before the Shah is going to wind up leaving. But it's with this uprising that, you suddenly have, fundamentalists taking over, who are going to, Iranian women up until this period wear Western clothes.
Yep.
And by the time this is over, they're going to be required to wear hijabs, or at least headscarves, sometimes burqas, whatever, given, depending on where in the country they are, I think. But yeah, I mean, this is a classic sort of reactionary Venus retrograde, if you will. in that
Yeah, but I
sense.
was also talking about the recent issues with women. I think there was just
Okay.
some particular thing that was happening in Iran earlier this year where some women were arrested. Even I think that was
Okay.
also true last year. So I don't know, but yeah, they're
Sorry, I
Apuba.
realized I hadn't been sharing the screen when I was showing this slide. This is
Oh,
a
okay,
mistake I've made in the past because I'm an idiot.
you're not. But this,
Well, I'm
yeah, I mean, I just kind of was okay. This is 1978. Yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah.
this is
This is what I was just talking about, but
yeah,
I
what you
was
were just
talking
talking
about
about.
it as if you
Okay.
guys could see it and you couldn't because I forget sometimes. So yeah, my point being just that this is that red two leading up to the Shah leading, and yeah, this is so Venus retrograde isn't always progressive. I mean, the Iranian Revolution, okay, and on the one hand, it's progressive because it's countering imperialism, but on the other hand, of course, you're having this tremendous social repression because of the regime, and a lot of the freedoms that we think are valuable in the West are suddenly tossed aside here. So, and in that sense, certainly with regard to what women can wear, the Venus retrograde was not a yeah. It's not always it's always about the Venus retrograde is when the consensus shifts, when we're
Of,
changing,
of
when the
yeah,
collective is changing its mind about something. The
any
zeitgeist is
number of
going for
things.
a
Yeah, I
review.
mean,
You know.
because one thing Apu was saying, and the skeptic in me kind of crops up with it. I just think Venus retrograde always is always a problem for me with astrology. Brings up things related to women's rights. Has that been your experience? Because I don't think that's true.
Um, oh, no, it's got quite a bit to do with that. Specifically, especially when it's about changing, very often it has to do with women's rights.
So, what do you think is
Um,
happening now? Besides, like they're asking about I guess rights to drive in Saudi Arabia, which has always been an issue. Um, I
yeah,
mean, like
yeah.
what are you seeing now that indicates that
Well,
this is different from any other time that women have experienced challenges related to their rights?
yeah, no, I mean, we're coming back to like what I was saying about racial strife in America, or violence in the Middle East, where they're just things that seem to happen almost every day. But that being said, the Venus retrograde periods do tend to sort of blow them up into sort of controversies where people are trying to like visibly aggressively um, shift the consensus one way or the
Yeah,
other.
maybe that's
Uh,
the title of your next permutation of this. Venus retrogrades from consensus to controversy. Um,
yeah, yeah, something like
yeah,
that.
I think that might be it. That's where we may have
Yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's like the racial divide, the gender divide. It's an issue that's with you every single day. But when these Venus retrograde periods come up, like yeah, that's when a lot of the battles are fought, one way or the other. Where they be sort of the progressive battles or the reactionary ones. Um, okay, I mean, the obvious thing obviously is in America, we're looking at, if you want to talk about gender, I think everything's being fought on the battlefield of Barbie. Um, symbolically, I know it's a movie, and not, real people dealing with real life issues, but it's a big part of
Well,
the
that's
conversation.
actually an important thing to mention because I think we tend to. I have found in pop media we tend to undervalue the significance of this film. Like I haven't seen it yet. I I
Hmm.
I'm one of the people who saw Oppenheimer instead of Barbie. There are people I've come to believe that there are three types of people right now. There are people who go to see Oppenheimer, there are people who go to see Barbie, and there are people who go to see both. Right?
Well, I've seen both.
Okay.
I've
Good for
seen both.
you. I mean, there are people who've seen both, right? I only seen
Yeah.
Oppenheimer, which is not to say I won't see Barbie. I just haven't yet. But
Okay.
what's significant about this film is one, it's a film that is the highest grossing film directed and I believe written by a woman. Um,
Yeah.
And also now,
And she was born August 5th, 1983, just as Venus was going retrograde in a red 5
wow,
interval.
here we are.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
and the other thing, I think you mentioned that before. The other thing is now it's cleared $1 billion
Yeah.
in terms of its sales. So I think that is really very significant.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
everyone kind of plays up.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, well, Oppenheimer, and I'm like, it's it's left Christopher Nolan in the dust, a man. So I think that's important.
What do you mean it's left Christopher Nolan in the
Meaning
dust?
in the dust. I mean, literally, people often will mention her success, Greta Gerwig, in tandem with his, rather than
Mhm.
recognizing her success has far
Okay.
surpassed his.
Oh, well, the financial,
Yeah,
sure,
and that's what I mean
sure.
by
Uh,
financials. I mean, like,
yeah,
because they're
yeah,
like, oh
yeah.
yeah, they were both winners this week. I'm like, why are you going to do that? I mean, when if we were talking about any other kind of person or film, and we were talking about how it really went beyond that.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I was just gonna show, this is just a slight aside, but since it's come up, um, the one thing that I can address, this isn't what's happening in India now, but there was a big Red 5 event in India back in 1975 as Venus was getting ready to go retrograde in Virgo to Leo in the Red 5 interval. Indira Gandhi, one of the world's first women heads of state, she imposed the emergency in India. This was, yeah, really kind of, she would at the next interval, the next Venus retrograde in 1977, she would lose power precisely because of this. But this is sort of like a brutal period in Indian history uh, where, yeah, the country was in a sort of state of alert for a good year and a half, and a lot of civil rights were curtailed, and political enemies were conveniently put out of service and that kind of thing. So yeah, that when I think of, she was also shot, but not during a Venus
no,
retrograde.
yeah.
So I'm talking about the Venus retrograde.
Well, now I'm curious.
Indira Gandhi was shot. Indira Gandhi was shot the day before Chris Brennan was born. So if you believe in reincarnation, Chris might be Indira
Stop it!
Gandhi. I don't know.
Stop it! Oh my God, got right back in the game. Um,
There we go.
what about? Do you have the chart or the information related Benazir Bhutto when she was shot? Was
Yeah, yeah, yeah. With Benazir Bhutto, you get more of a Mars signature with her. There's a lot of interesting parallels between Bhutto and Gandhi because both of their fathers were leaders,
right?
and to some extent they sort of take over because of the death. But here, where am I looking here? There's Benazir Bhutto. Yeah, she's born in 1953. After Venus had been retrograde. She is, I consider Benazir Bhutto a red 1. Here, one moment. Share my wheel with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is her natal chart. Venus was 47 days after the direct station. So it means it's about 3 days before the greatest elongation. So we're still in a red 1 interval here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's her chart. And then her murder, what you really get with her murder is a lot of Mars, because she was elected just coming out of a Mars retrograde. And where is she here? There she is. Yeah, it's Mars retrograde when she's killed. So this is when she was first elected Prime Minister of Pakistan, and this is Mars just coming out of its very rare retrograde in Aries. And then her death 19 years later, Mars retrograde very close to her natal Mars sun. So she's a Sun-Mars conjunction, but she's killed when Mars in the same spot is opposite the
Oh
sun.
wow, that's really
Yeah. So yeah, Her death, I think of as more of a Mars, trigger. I don't have her time of birth,
And that's
so this is,
interesting.
but just cyclically speaking, I think of this being a Mars situation.
And is Mars okay? Is Venus also? I mean, it's a morning star Venus for in both. Are they roughly about the
Right.
same amount of degrees apart from each other, or no?
What you mean
The Venus to
like the
Sun,
phase?
yeah, in terms of their phase.
Oh, it won't be quite that, no,
Okay, that would be
because
weird.
it's 109 days after. There had been a red 5 earlier in 2007 in the summer, but this is
Hmm.
December now. So no, it's not quite the same. But
It is interesting that they're like both morning stars. In terms of her death,
yeah,
is that is that
yeah.
something we also see with folks
Um,
correlate not just their
no,
death, but not just in terms of significant
I
moments like that?
I'd say that's a I mean, I see some really interesting patterns when it comes to death, but it isn't necessarily like if you're born in a morning star, you're going to die during a
Okay,
morning
I
star.
didn't think so, but I was curious.
But I do see some really interesting weird patterns with death and Venus cycles.
Hmm.
Yeah, in a big way. Um, my favorite one, I was just talking about it the other day. Well, it's come up in the slideshow. I showed how like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Cannonball Adderley, who were the three horn players on Kind of Blue, the biggest selling jazz album of all time, and they all died during red 5 intervals, years apart. Coltrane in 67, Adderley in 75, Davis in 91, but it's all during those intervals. There's other weird stories like that that are just,
That makes sense. That's interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing. I mean, I know that Opruba is talking about women's rights.
Apurva's asking about Pakistan's
Yeah, I
chart,
don't.
and
That's
the
too
thing
much in
is,
the weeds.
it's very similar to India. That's the it's kind of like doing charts for Central American countries. Like 5 of the Central American countries were founded on the exact same day. Their chart is going to be
Yeah,
really,
she says
really
that. I think,
similar.
but one thing
Yeah.
I want to challenge or at least correct too, depending on how you want to look at it. I mean, the Venus retrogrades. What we're saying, in the cycles related to Venus, is that we're not just talking about the rights of women, but we're talking about consensus and rights for anybody who's deemed marginal or some. Yeah.
It's even, but I mean, that's what you and I feel it is. But if you look at everyone, if you think of Venus as it relates to everyone, the feminists and the misogynists, like in some kind of unified, like this is what Venus means to you, no matter how uh, uh, liberal or conservative you are, blah blah blah. It's about what the accepted attitude is.
Hmm.
Do we all agree? Like for instance, 100 years ago, right? Like casual racism was just kind of right. Like, if you had someone say something like appallingly racist, even if you had, other white people there who didn't necessarily think the same way, it was just sort of like, okay, that's what people do. It's normalized. Whereas today, it's like, what the hell are you doing? You know what I mean? Like it's under the consensus today. I mean, we still have racist people,
Hmm.
but the consensus today is that, racism is this like, appalling attitude. Whereas 100 years ago, it was more sort of, there were a lot of people, it was just normalized. There's a lot of even people who weren't necessarily aggressively
Yeah.
racist.
Oh, well, not
You
in,
know what I'm
and not
getting at?
yeah, and it's not just
There is just a, and it's not necessarily that people are more or less racist at this time or at that time, but there's a sort of a social code, today. And this is why you have so much more dog whistling today, whereas 100 years ago you didn't need to dog whistle. You just said
right.
what you thought, no matter how, what it was.
Well, it's
um
yeah, I
the,
think yeah, just to go along.
and so this is what the so we have a consensus. We have a, I mean, not a real consensus. Not It's not like everyone thinks the exact same thing, but everyone knows what the sort of the code is. And it's not the law, it's this other thing. It's the unwritten sort of social contract, which every 18 months when you get a Venus retrograde, that comes up for review. And so sometimes it is like this progressive thing, like in 2015, gay marriage is passed by the Supreme Court. That's a Venus retrograde thing right there. Although that was Venus retrograde with Jupiter. So that did merge the consensus with law. Um, but it's also, like I showed, it's Iran in 1978, which is, sort of a different turn against women. It's not a liberating thing, and unless you're a woman who wants to wear a hijab, who wants to be required to wear one. It's this thing that's curtailing a freedom that we think of, but it's still a Venus retrograde event. You still have, like, you know what I mean? Like,
no, you're making a good point. I mean, and so
it's the changing times for everyone, whether you're racist or anti-racist or no matter who you are. There's something about all of us that we're all in this pool, and the attitudes are always changing. We're all fighting a sort of battle, if you will, to change people's minds, right? I mean, that's a big part of the campaign.
Yeah, it's who's in and who's out. Yeah, that's something Stephanie, because Stephanie's made now 2 points that, one, I've often thought about. Actually, not often. It's just recent. Thanks to you, Nick. It was your appearance on the Astrology podcast where you also mentioned the 18-month cycle with Venus. And then that's when I also immediately thought about the nodes at that time. I was like, oh, they don't exactly correlate, meaning that they don't happen, but roughly just thinking about cycles, 18 months.
Well, their cycles merge at 56.
Okay.
At the age of 56, you get a synodic Venus return and a nodal return. Both Adolf Hitler and Abraham Lincoln died not long after their 56 birthdays. In Hitler's case, like 10 days. Now, I'm not saying, oh, what? So, does that mean Lincoln's like Hitler?
No. I didn't think that, but I'm thinking like, Nick, aren't we almost 56? Why don't you shut the fuck up? Why don't you shut up? Shut up, Nick.
Well, I think this is my tip for astrologers. If you're looking at a chart where, like, say, Venus is square the nodes, or Venus is conjunct one of the nodes, or there's some existing dynamic in a given horoscope that you're looking at where Venus is connected to the nodes, that at the age of 56, that's going to be a double return, and it's probably a really consequential age for that person.
Yeah. No, I didn't think
that's that's one of my little synodic cycle cheat sheet things that I offer to astrologers. Like, if you see a chart like that and the person is like close to 56, or they've already been 56, that 56 is going to be this flashpoint.
Well, it's interesting because, well, one, I just want to make a correction. No, Stephanie, I didn't think you thought they were inherently connected. I didn't think that either. No. I think it's just to recognize 18 and 18, and this speaks to something else. So, cosmobiologists, they look at the nodes as significators related to connection and connecting, which is interesting.
Yeah,
because I don't see that as active in other aspects of the Western tradition, or as much between Rahu and Ketu from the Eastern tradition. But I
know what you mean. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that we have the nodal axis as related to that, and it's interesting that Venus might be in the mix by time, but not directly. But you're about to say something.
Yeah, no, I was a cosmobiologist, really early in my study of astrology. I was an Ebertine head, really early out of the gate, and sort of learned other facets of astrology later in many ways. So I've always thought of the nodes as having, they're the points where the sun and moon meet, right? It's the me and the everybody else. So there absolutely is, and so many of the sort of the significations relating to the nodes have to do with your community, your neighborhood, your country, like, patriotism and all that stuff is very sort of nodal. It's the me and the collective. It's I'm an American with all these other, all that, or whatever it is. I'm
whatever.
I'm from country X. That's all, sort of heavy duty nodal stuff. And it's also, I guess, the Rahu Ketu thing it's the channel between sort of conscious sin and unconscious sin. Like the north node knows when it's, I always liken it to, when the north node commits a murder, it commits a pre-planned, premeditated murder for personal gain. Whereas the south node just like grabs a weapon and attacks the first person who's closest, but it's not directly motivated. That the target might be the intended one, or it might just be the wrong person in the wrong place. It's just like blah. It's just rage. It's not conscious or premeditated. It's reactive and instinctive and unconscious, just reacting, whereas the North Node is specifically proactive,
That's true.
making things happen, and the South Node is just like, oh, this just happened to me and I'm
Well,
going to
that's
react.
interesting, considering that we were looking at Mars, a chart that had Mars and Capricorn in relation in the same sign as North Node in Capricorn, and I've come to believe that the Mars and Capricorn conjoined to the South Node in Capricorn can be dangerous. So that's something that we might see 19 years from now in play from 2020, which also goes back to 2001, right? When Mars is conjoined to the South Node. So that actually plays to what you're saying, in that dialogue about, indiscriminate, because even though, 9/11 had folks intentionally willing to murder, but who they murdered, right? Specifically,
It
didn't matter.
Yeah. Well, although I'd say like a school shooting is maybe a better example, because 9/11, it was a target. It didn't matter like specifically who the individual was, but it was to harm Americans.
Oh, sure.
It wasn't quite a South Node. I'd say that's pretty North Node stuff. But I hear you, because Mars was in Capricorn at 9/11. I went to your statement that Mars in Capricorn with the South Node is a bad thing. It's true. It was. You're right. Mars was with the South Node at 9/11.
And also at the start of the pandemic, because I actually was concerned about. So the president of the United States, Trump, was in India, where it was going toward exact, and I was concerned that there would be an attempt on his life or something like that. I don't care who is the president. I don't want the president shot or hurt.
Okay.
So I remember thinking, like, is Mars conjoined to the South Node going to be something related to terror again? And it wasn't directly related to terror in the sense of an attack, but it definitely was a sense of terror related to, the pandemic.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was
On top.
Yeah, and they're sort of like phantom type fears, aren't they? Whether it's a pandemic or 9/11, it's sort of like, something way beyond an individual's it's not like having one person come at you with a weapon. It's sort of an overwhelming feeling. Yeah, I'm just looking at South Node Mars conjunctions, generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say these people are bad people, but I wonder about
no. Events that coincide with that.
So
right. So a lot of interesting diversions here. I'm not sure if I had anything else. I mean, I do have more slides, but actually, let me just show a few more. And
exhaust yourself, Nick. I mean, I guess that's one way to get me back again. I mean, I guess we have another.
Yeah, well, I think I have a feeling if we started you now on yours, that you would wind up
spilling over too.
Spilling over anyway. So best to like sort of, have yours start a new episode. Okay. Are you open to coming back?
Yeah, but how about if I came back let me see, but I think maybe if I came back the 21st.
Yeah, that's fine. Yep. Next Monday is my birthday anyway.
That's right. You're just saying birthday is also Marcus Garvey, right? Isn't he the 14th or the 15th?
I think he's the 15th.
Okay.
I think. I can look that up.
I can look that up. I have it somewhere, but I'm just curious.
I have him right.
Oh, you have him? Okay. Well, you're fast.
Remember, he's here. He is
15th.
August 17th.
17th, 2 days later from the 15th.
Yeah, he's born the same day as Emperor Charles of Austria, who's the last Habsburg. The one who has to resign as the war is ending. But the interesting thing is Marcus Garvey is a red 5. He's his Venus is about to station retrograde. So here I am talking about red 5s. And you've pulled out the man who was a red 5. Yeah, there he is. 13 days before Venus went retrograde. So yeah, Garvey himself is a red 5. Okay. So just moving off the red 5s, I just wanted to talk about some big uprisings that occurred during Venus retrogrades, but that weren't red 5 retrogrades. This was a slave uprising in Louisiana in 1811. It's actually called the biggest slave uprising ever in American history. So this is bigger than Nat Turner. It went on for over a month. It doesn't get as celebrated as
I don't
Nat
know if I
Turner,
know
I
about
suppose.
this one.
Yeah, no, there's a good book I've read. I can show you the book just now that I've read about it. Very event, but yeah, it's considered the biggest slave uprising in American history. This what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. This was sort of like, this is kind of the January 6th of its day, but it was racially motivated, a citizens insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina, that also turned into this sort of mass lynching.
Do you remember what they were going?
It's literally like they're literally trying to. It's almost like the not the Second Confederacy, but it is sort of like a citizens uprising. Like they're trying to overthrow the regime. I can go to my notes to look it up.
It's okay. No, I was just curious.
Or even I have a book here. Oh, I have to open my Kindle to do that. I'll come back to the book in a minute. The Atlanta race riot. This is again another sort of race war, a sort of another of these mass lynchings. You know, when you're using the term race war, like I was saying the other day, but particularly before 1919. 1919 is when you start to see African Americans fighting back. You know, in the post sort of slave uprising context, in big ways. But up until now, when I'm using the term race riot, it's usually a sort of the whites just going out and in that sort of South Node way. It's not, they're just sort of targeting, Black people in general and not a specific individual. Jumping ahead to the Red 3, this is an important summer, the summer of 1964. There's the civil rights workers who were in Mississippi trying to work with voting rights there in Mississippi, and 3 of them were murdered. The movie Mississippi Burning is about this. Yeah. This is that murder. That there were 3 young men, two Jewish white guys and a black guy. I forget their names. Cheney is one of them. Michael Cheney. I have their names down somewhere, but yeah, they were. Is it Michael Cheney or James Cheney? Anyway, I remember one of them is Cheney. Not long after, while they're still digging up those bodies. Oh, you looking that up for me? Thank you. Okay, I appreciate that. It's not right to leave them unnamed. It's just you know how I am with names.
Yeah, James Cheney, Andrew Goodman,
right,
and Michael Schwerner.
Schwerner, yeah.
Schwerner,
that's right. Schwerner, yeah. Okay, yeah. And James Cheney was the African American guy. Yeah. Okay. This is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So yeah, you can see Johnson there. I don't see Dr. Oh yeah, there's Dr. King at the right with Ralph Abernathy next to him. That's obviously important. And then in 64, we did have a string of uprisings. You can see here, this was one in Harlem that got pretty ugly in the summer of 64. You also had Rochester, a classic story. A young guy gets arrested and people protest, and it becomes a big protest. And then Philadelphia also another situation, same thing. Someone gets arrested and the local community protests and an uprising occurs. So you had a big thing in the summer of 64 as well. Now, obviously, like again with the 60s, the 60s were the 60s. It was a tumultuous, violent period. And I showed how the Martin Luther King sort of reaction occurred outside the red intervals, but largely the summer of 64 during the red 3 interval and the summer of 67 during the red 5 interval, those Venus retrogrades do have the highest concentration of these uprisings, altogether, relative to other periods in the 60s.
Yeah, but still, you resist the idea that the Lucifer Venus is a warlike Venus?
Yeah, because it really comes up everywhere. Like, I'd love it. I'd love for it to be that, no pun intended, black and white. Um, yeah, sorry. Um, I'd love for it to be, but I just don't. I see, generals and insurrectionaries and all kinds of different violent people born with morning and or evening star Venuses. So it's hard for me to, and events, and I see terrible events happening with morning and evening star Venuses. So it's really hard for me to be that equivocal about
Okay.
it, much as I'd like to be.
You mean unequivocal, actually? um, where you could just say, yeah,
Oh, okay. Yeah. Did I misspeak?
yeah,
Sorry.
sorry.
Thank you. Um, all right. Um, well, when I say equivocal, meaning like I can draw a line really clearly.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Um, right. Miami. I'm suddenly running through my my vocabulary. Like, am I losing my
No, you're
vocabulary?
not.
Okay, so this Miami in 1980. This was this was a police shooting an African American guy that sparked another sort of uprising. This was a big one at the time. Um, and then this is just a mass shooting, not necessarily racially motivated, although the guy's twisted as hell. This is the guy who came in and shot up a
Mm-hmm.
movie theater during
In
the
Aurora, yeah.
Batman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man. And then, okay, here we are. We're coming to 2014. This particular event, I learned about this moments after it happened because our friend and
Matthew
colleague
Curry.
Matthew Curry was on Facebook, and he was right there at the Staten Island ferry, and he saw the police strangle Eric Garner to death. So this was Eric Garner, a guy who was selling loose cigarettes, right? I mean, I remember
Yep,
when I was a
Lucy's.
cigarette
Mm-hmm.
smoker. Yeah, when I was a cigarette smoker in New York, you would do that. You'd buy a cigarette for a quarter or something. When I was a broke cigarette smoker in New York City, that was something that I would do. I don't know if I ever bought one from Eric, but I very well might have. So there you go. And for that crime, his life was extinguished. And then not long after this, we had Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, which is sort of a well, I mean, what do you think, Sam? I mean, I'm weary of making sort of definitive statements like this is the one that
That surfaces Black Lives Matter. Yeah,
right. I mean, I guess
it
it is,
is.
but in another way, it's like it's all of them. It's every single event I've talked
I mean,
about that
but
sort of
Ferguson is
culminates with
kind of like
Michael Brown.
ground zero
Yeah,
related to
yeah.
that.
So
I mean, from
this is the one.
2014.
Yeah.
Even though some measure of it we could hark back to Trayvon Martin's murder, but
Yes. Yeah.
this becomes
Which I don't have a slide for here for some reason. I do have the chart for it, but for some reason I don't have a slide. I should have made one.
yeah.
But you're right. I think Trayvon sort of leading to this. But yeah, I mean, Ferguson is a kind of ground zero.
Yeah, so I think this is pretty significant in terms of the emergence and surfacing of BLM, and here we are almost on the anniversary of that moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some 9 years later.
Yeah. 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 I mean, some of these, I don't know. I was puzzled by, astrologically speaking. I would say I expected 2015 to be like that crazy summer, and it was, but 2014 sort of got the jump on it.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose. But yeah, this is how things played out. I mean, this is when Black Lives Matter really became, well, as it's known, what it's known for, I suppose, is the way to put it.
The best of what it's known for, because there's some worst of it.
Okay. Yes.
There's some worst aspects of it.
Yes.
But yeah, the best of what it's known for.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I have one more, and then we can wrap it up. It's the obvious one, the summer of 2020, which is when we lost George Floyd. So this was a red 3. I showed you 1964 and 1980. There were, uprisings then. But this was the murder of George Floyd during the red 3 Venus retrograde. And this sparked a whole new sort of, I mean, we were already in the middle of COVID. But when we started this conversation, Sam, we were talking about George because this brought the whole Venus retrograde versus racial discord matter out into the open on Twitter, and opened up that conversation. And in many ways, we're going through the slideshow to explain it to whoever might not have understood why, when this happened, why we were thinking about
this is
Venus
a
retrograde in
parallel to
relation to the
this
event.
is a parallel to the 2012 Venus retrograde, right? In terms of Venus and
Yes.
Gemini, yeah.
Yeah.
So that I
Yeah.
mean that also taps into, Trayvon Martin. But what's significant,
Right.
and
Yes.
what's significant about this particular death too, and I've made this parallel elsewhere. The exact degree of that Uranus at 8 degrees Taurus is at the exact same degree as when Crispus Attucks was murdered.
Oh yes, I remember you showing that.
So that is another parallel, especially speaking of Venus and the Venus ruled sign, and this has been my feeling. So one thing to remember about Crispus Attucks' murder,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you're going to get it up now.
Yeah, I am. But keep talking.
The key thing about his murder is that it is the far prelude to something larger that happens as the quote unquote Revolutionary War. So I felt even at the time when I saw that about George Floyd, I was like, oh, this is the beginning of something. We think, and it was something significant in the sense that this was a catalyst for a lot of different changes, some around the world. I mean, some of the biggest protests in England, other parts of the
Mm-hmm.
world, where I was like, oh, there are black people there. So yeah, we were seeing this kind of all around. Yeah, if you want to magnify that, because I can't really. Okay, here we go.
Oh, can you
I
not
can
see?
see it
Okay,
now.
so the inside chart is the Boston Massacre, where Crispus Attucks was killed.
Mm-hmm.
The first person to die in the events leading up to what we now call the Revolutionary War. And here's George Floyd's murder. Yeah, and indeed, you're absolutely right. Uranus at 8 degrees of Taurus in both of them.
Yeah, and the other significant thing too, I mean, it's going toward a Pluto return for the United States, and this is
Yeah, so it was a little past the Pluto
right
return of
that
the
particular
Boston
that
Massacre.
particular point. But
Yeah.
the United States is Pluto return. It's kind of going in
Yeah.
general in that moment. So it's
Yeah.
really interesting to kind of see, and I didn't realize the moons are also in Cancer.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And someone's commenting on the nodes too. Yeah, there's definitely parallels to the nodes. There's a nodal. I think that's more of like a near nodal reversal, or going toward it.
Neptune in opposite signs, and the early Aquarius. You've got Mars in early Aquarius in Boston, and then Saturn in early Aquarius in Minneapolis.
So yeah, I think something is going to surface again. I think we've gotten. Unfortunately, I've talked about this on Twitter. I think we've gotten beyond that moment for a little bit. Where people are like, I'm tired of hearing about diversity. White lives matter too.
That was we were hearing that all along.
Right.
I mean, it was
Yeah, but it's surfacing again with a lot more vim and vigor. So I think that's anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, the pushback is really loud right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was talking about dog whistles, and yeah, but we're kind of leaving the age of dog whistles, and I have mixed feelings about that. Like it's in a way, it's like, okay, good. Masks are coming off. Everyone's speaking what they really think, and that should be a good thing. But of course, the flip side is some of the things that people think that they were hiding behind dog whistles are really terrible ideas.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Like I can complain either way. I can either complain that people are hiding behind a sort of false civility and speaking in code, or they're just mask off and being openly and proudly ugly.
And that brings us full circle, because those are Venusian traits too, to some degree. It's kind of like
yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. from one to the other. Venus is, I mean, this is what I mean about consensus. It's, manners, right? I mean, like, uh, any interaction I have with human beings, whether they're, racially different or the same as me, on my best days, I'm polite and considerate, and on my worst days, I'm rude and inconsiderate. And and that's, I mean, part of what racism is like, establishing some kind of code that means you don't have to be polite or considerate, towards someone, I mean, obviously it can go a lot further than mere politeness, but at the very, that's what we're ultimately sort of fighting about, is like, that sort of common courtesy that we have towards each other. And what are the rules of common courtesy? Some of it is sort of, the usual stuff, like, hygiene, right? We're all supposed to keep good hygiene, in part just like for everyone else's sake, right? You don't walk around stinking and nasty so that people have to like endure that. And that's a Venusian thing. But then, when you get to these really important points of interaction, yeah, this is what I mean by the consensus. This is what I mean by Venus being that common pool that we're all supposed to agree on. What is done and not done, what is right and not right. And I think that's where this all fits
And
in.
it goes to the other points that we're talking about, in terms of consensus on both sides of the aisle on a variety of different topics, whether we're talking about with
Oh yeah,
women
yeah,
along
yeah.
aspects of race. I mean, there are probably other things that we could find. Maybe there might even be some correlations with fashion.
Oh, absolutely. Oh yeah, yeah. No,
Or
it's
music
just, yeah,
genres and tastes, but it becomes, like you
yeah,
said, some way in which we have the tacit contract that we seek to revise,
yeah,
or just revulse against.
yeah,
So the
yeah,
social contract, it's
yeah,
kind of yeah, from consensus to controversy to some degree.
yeah,
Like, women don't behave like that. That's not being ladylike. That's not this.
yeah,
All these other
yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah. We don't do that here.
Right. Try
Yeah.
that in this. Wait, there is.
Try that in a
Try
small
that in a
town.
small. Try that in a small town. It's kind of like, yeah,
Yeah,
maybe that's kind of an interesting point of controversy. Where it's like, yeah, I don't know if maybe some people across the pond may not know what we're talking about. So there's this song that's come out by a country singer who basically, and I've listened, I read the lyrics as well, who basically is saying about some of the things, the revolutionary actions and other crimes and other things that are happening in larger cities. He's essentially saying, try that in a small town, like, where we don't do that. We don't play that here.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that is one of the most universal. I've lived in 3 continents and 5 countries, and the thing that we all have is the
Hmm.
urban rural divide. And you have it in China, you have it in Russia, you have it in India, you have it in South Africa, you definitely have it all over Europe, and you definitely have it all over Canada and the US. And it's like it's the fundamental
Hmm.
uh, uh,
Well, it's also in our voting. I mean,
yeah,
like, I think,
yeah,
anyone, I saw that. I was up in, where was I? Edmonton. I was in Alberta.
oh yeah, yeah,
And what I saw is, they had a major election there. It was the same kind of
yeah,
dynamic between those in the city
rural and urban,
and
yeah,
those in the rural areas. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Alberta's Canada's Texas,
right.
as we like to say. It's all oil and steers.
Yeah.
And you land at Calgary Airport, and it's kind of like landing at Austin Airport, where men are unironically wearing cowboy hats.
Yeah. I went to Edmonton. So I want to go to Calgary now, because
Okay.
Edmonters, have a certain kind of way in which they view people from Calgary and vice versa.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's Canadians. We're great at this. Everyone thinks we're so nice and polite, but we're full of these sort of interurban rivalries. I mean, I'm from Montreal, just like mentioned Toronto, and I'm required by code to be just
Well, I'm from Buffalo,
brutal.
so that whole idea,
Okay.
well, you know that whole idea of Canadians being ultra polite and all that, I'm like, that's a facade.
Yeah, it's
I saw that
facade.
in Buffalo.
Yeah, ever seen a hockey game? Yeah,
yeah, right.
That's my joke. Like, Canadians and Americans, our cultures are fundamentally very similar, but the main difference is in Canada, we like our sports psychotically violent and our society boring and slow.
Whereas Americans like
like their society violent,
psychotically
psychotically violent, and their sports boring and slow. That's like a multi-layered jab at everyone in their own way.
That's funny.
But yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I just find
we'll be back in 2 weeks, folks. We've enjoyed everyone who's kind of contributed. Apurba, I'm assuming you're in India. B. Havens, Stephanie King,
and everyone else.
And whoever is lurking, more in the shadows.
Yes.
I don't know who else might be there.
Lurkers most welcome. Yeah, a lot of people just watch and don't say anything, which is also
cool.
Great. We're very grateful as well. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for coming back and giving me the chance to show all these slides that I've been making for years, and I'm trying to put together a narrative video that really incorporates all of this. But having conversations like this helps me articulate what I'm trying to put out in the video. So, and of course, this document exists for people to peruse down the road as well. So thank you, Sam. Where can people find you,
Unlockastrology.com.
Unlockastrology.com. The great Sam Reynolds. My name is Nick Dagan Best. I'm
the birthday boy.
BestAstrologer.com. Yeah, well, it's 7 days away from 55. And then next year is my Venus nodal return birthday. All right,
Thank
Sam.
you, man.
All the best. We'll see you in 2 weeks on the 21st. The same bat channel, same bat time.
Oh, and then Reverend Kai is here. Okay, thank you, Reverend Kai.
Yeah.
All right.
Hey, Kai. Kai's often here. Yeah. All right, folks.
All right.
Have a great day. Have a great week. Thank you, Sam.
You.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.